So this is the formula Trump administration has used to calculate the reciprocal tariffs on different countries. This is also known as a reciprocal tariff formula. Tariffs are also known as import duty, which means that whenever an importer imports goods from outside of USA into USA, he or she has to pay some tax on those goods. Let's look at the formula now. So this is a Greek symbol called tau, and this is delta, another Greek symbol which represents change. And together they represent change in tariff for a given country. I just represents any country. It could be Australia, England, India, or Penguin Islands. XI and MI represents exports to a given country and imports from a given country in US dollars respectively. This symbol here is another Greek symbol known as epsilon. Given the amount of Greek symbols in this equation, you would think that out of all the countries in the world, Greece would be swimming in cash. Well, anyway. So epsilon represents elasticity of demand for imported goods, and the word elastic here implies the level of sensitivity. It basically tells us how sensitive a demand for imports is to price changes. A value of 5 implies the demand is highly elastic. If the epsilon has a value of 5, then this implies that the demand is highly elastic, meaning if prices rise due to tariffs, demand for those products would decrease 50%, thus reducing the imports. And this symbol is another Greek symbol called phi, and this represents the price passed through to customers, which means how much of the tariff cost is passed on to the customers in United States. For example, if United States is importing bananas from India, and before the 26% tariff on India, the bananas used to cost $1 per kilogram, then with that 26% tariff, if all the tariff is passed on to the American consumers, the new cost of bananas will be $1.26 per kilogram.
Bummer.
So Trump administration has used a value of 4 for epsilon and a value of 0.25 for phi. And they have cited a few studies, and I'm not going to go through all the studies. The only thing I would say is that it's very convenient that the multiplication of epsilon and phi equals 1. It's quite interesting though. And because epsilon is 4, this means that the demand is highly elastic, and the American consumers will react very strongly to the price changes. This means that a 10% increase in the cost of goods would lead to 40% demand decrease. And then when we consider phi, its value is 0.25. This shows that Trump's administration has made an assumption that only 25% of the tariff cost will be passed on to the American consumers. Now, whether this transpires or not remains to be seen, but what is important to note is that when you multiply 25% with 4, you get 100% demand reduction. And this is very critical. What this means is that with 25% increase in the cost of goods, American consumers will not buy any of the imported goods. And this is a massive assumption. And this is what Trump has been saying, that he wants all the companies to manufacture products in USA. Practically, this can never happen. How many companies will set up manufacturing plants in USA? And it depends on their desire and also on their ability to mobilize manufacturing in USA. So this is a massive assumption. So the multiplication of epsilon and phi equals 1, and then this formula becomes this, with only imports in the denominator. So it is a trade deficit divided by imports. So then this formula calculates trade deficit divided by imports. And this is a very odd way to calculate reciprocal tariffs. And then this delta tau becomes a measure of trade gap between USA and the other countries. This means it does not actually calculate a reciprocal tariff, but rather quantifies the disparity in tariff. This is another interesting observation. Because I'm interested in the mathematics of this formula, I populated my own Excel spreadsheet with the data I could find on US government website. There were a few countries whose data was difficult to find, so I used another government source, and that source is also included in the spreadsheet. And I put that spreadsheet on GitHub, so if anybody wants to look at it, they can go and do that. It was quite fascinating to see the trade deficit of United States with different countries after I completed the
calculations, and a few things jumped out.
USA does not have a trade surplus with any of these countries, which is quite obvious, otherwise they would not be in this tariff list. And the biggest trade surplus is with China, and then it is with European Union. So America clearly is a consumer-focused economy. And this is not a bad thing at all, but like most things, it has its pros and cons. Also, the reciprocal tariffs are half of the calculated ones in all cases. So now let's look at China here. Let's put the import and export values and epsilon phi values in the formula. 143.5 minus 438.9 divided by 4 multiplied by 0.25 multiplied by 438.9, and this gives us 67% tariff. And Trump initially imposed 34% tariff on China before slapping another 100% on top of the 34%. But this isn't reciprocal tariff at all, because the true definition of a reciprocal tariff is that if a country A imposes 10% tariff on country B's goods, then country B in response imposes a 10% tariff on country A's goods. And this formula over here does not do it, it just calculates trade gap.
Now, the stock market's reaction to tariffs is mostly governed by investor sentiment rather than immediate economic fundamentals, and the stock market sort of follows a herd mentality.
This is because when the tariffs are announced, investors worry about higher costs for businesses, potential supply chain disruptions resulting in economic slowdowns. And the stock market is very, very sensitive to uncertainty. And this uncertainty leads to an initial sell-off as traders and investors rush to reduce their exposure to affected industries. Tariffs lead to higher prices on imported goods, reducing consumers' purchasing power. And as people cut back on spending, companies may see declining sales, reinforcing fears of an economic downturn. And when investors rush to sell their investments first, fearing they will get stuck with declining assets, the economic slowdown becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating a feedback loop where selling snowballs into a larger market decline. And this is what we saw immediately after Trump announced his tariffs. A massive sell-off in the stock market. Now, over time, markets stabilize as businesses adjust to new trade policies. Some industries may benefit from tariffs by experiencing increased domestic production, while others struggle with higher costs and lost trade partnerships. And all of this will happen in future, and it is very difficult to quantify all of this right now. An important factor to consider is that the US must have the necessary manufacturing capacity or the willingness to quickly ramp up production of the goods currently being imported. Without this, tariffs alone will not effectively boost the domestic industries. In an earlier interview last year in December, Trump said that if you make the tariffs obnoxiously high, the companies would quickly come back to USA for manufacturing rather than taking years. Now, this remains to be seen. But then the objective of the multinational firms is to maximize profits, not to bring back jobs to USA. So the objective of US government and that of multinational corporations is not aligned, and there would be a tussle. Only time will tell, but I would say it is unlikely that the manufacturing comes back to USA in a way USA is hoping it would. Trump's tariff calculations assume that the demand elasticity and price pass-through would remain constant across all imported goods, including cars, food, toys, garments, sports equipment, and others, meaning that consumers will equally reduce their spending on all of these products. Now, this is a broad and oversimplified assumption, as different items have varying levels of desirability and demand sensitivity. Consequently, assuming uniform demand elasticity and cost pass-through may not accurately reflect the complexities of consumer behavior and market dynamics. One thing tariffs don't consider is the buying power of the trading countries. For example, Bangladesh or Fiji are relatively poor countries with limited disposable income and very little buying power. High tariffs on these countries would not mean a significant boost for US domestic industries, because these countries lack the financial capacity to import large quantities of American goods regardless of tariff levels. In the case of Bangladesh, it is very much dependent upon its exports to USA because its people are paid very little. This reflects an imbalance in the trade relationship rather than a trade barrier. The median monthly salary in Bangladesh is $226. Due to its limited purchasing power, Bangladesh is unable to afford many high-priced US goods. Now, one way to look at it is this. Do you honestly think Americans should be working in factories and making t-shirts and socks for people in Bangladesh? And for Bangladesh to buy these t-shirts and socks from America, they need to have higher purchasing power, or alternatively, the Americans should make the t-shirts and socks much cheaper so that Bangladeshis can buy it from them. Is this gonna happen? I don't think so. There's always an imbalance of trade relationship between rich and poor countries. Even if tariff makes imports from these countries expensive, their buying power is so low that reducing imports from them won't impact US trade balance much. And what about Vietnam? What did Vietnam do to deserve 46% tariff? Well, the argument from US is that they do not want China to reroute its exports from Vietnam to avoid the tariffs. So this is part of a broader trade policy aimed at preventing China from using Vietnam as a workaround to avoid tariffs. Now let's look at a country that is very close to my heart, Nepal. You can see that the exports and imports from Nepal are roughly equal, which means that US has no trade deficit with Nepal, and Trump has been just with Nepal and has not levied any tariffs on Nepal. Well, that's great. And poor Australia. US actually has a trade surplus with Australia, yet it has imposed a 10% tariff on Australia. And this value here does not actually mean anything. It is just a trade deficit, 17.9 divided by import, 16.7. But in terms of tariff calculation, this value means absolutely nothing. Now, regardless of that, Trump has imposed a 10% tariff on Australia. Now that ought to teach those Aussies a lesson, calling America their close friend. Huh?
America is the largest economy in the world and is the largest consumer of products. And with its consumer-based economy, some economists say trade deficit is good, some say trade deficit is bad. But like anything in life, different people have different opinion. And much the same way, economists do not have a unanimous view on how to run the economy. Same is the case with America. People agree with the problem and they disagree with the solution. So if America wants to become a manufacturing-based economy, it may have to devalue its dollar so other countries can buy its products. So countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Fiji, these poor countries who have less purchasing power, they should be able to buy American-made products. I was interested in the mathematics of the tariff formula and wanted to talk about some basic things. Now I must go and join the Penguin Army, but I will leave you with this gem of a quote. Cheers.
Losing money costs you nothing. This is just the reality of life. You're gonna, like, were you young and dumb? How much money did you lose? Everyone loses money. Everyone loses money. It costs you nothing.